Morning everybody, welcome. It's the 2nd of November and this is the meeting of the NHS Lancashire and South Cumbria Integrated Care Board. No one new at the table today, but two important members of the bigger team to welcome. Craig was at our last meeting, who's joining as Chief of Health and Care Integration, started now. Great to have you on the team, Craig, and also to Asim Patel. Welcome, Asim. I'm sure you'll get to work out who we all are during the meeting, but again, really pleased that you've joined the team and very much we all look forward to working with you as the Chief Digital Officer. I've received one apology from absence today. John Redman, who is our participant Director of Adult Care, Social Services from Cumbria. I've not received any new declarations of interest, not received any questions in advance relating to items on the agenda. In terms of the minutes, we have an extensive minute of the last meeting. I think the one issue that I've got outstanding is the EPRR workshop, which we said that we'll put in train. We're just waiting for confirmation of a date, but it's unlikely to happen before January. Are there any other points on the minutes, please? Jeff?
Thanks, Chair. It's just a very general brief point, and that is, and I recognise doing minutes is a very difficult job, so this is not a criticism, it's just a suggestion. But there are several paragraphs of things I've said, and ever so slight wording changes would make them have a much better meaning, and I wonder whether we, as individuals, we could be circulated with the paragraphs relevant to ourselves so we could sense check them. Just for minute, it's just minute changes in nuances in make a big difference to the meaning. I just wonder whether that would be possible. Yeah,
it's very possible. Thank you, Jeff. You'll have more paragraphs to check than anybody else. Are there any other points on the minutes? Oh, thank you. Can we accept the minutes, please? Thank you very much. Chief Executive's report, Kevin.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Not a conventional report here. It's more personal, more reflective. I'd welcome feedback as to whether that's helpful or whether you'd prefer a more formal report going forward. I'll cover three main issues today that feature in the report. Now, I thought I'd just also mention a few other things that have happened in the last few weeks that may be of interest. So first issue is performance improvement. We obviously had the board meeting with Morgan Bay, board a couple of weeks back. You know, as a system we're soft 3 rated, a bit embarrassing really, not good news for patients, staff or taxpayers. It holds us back from doing some of the more clever stuff because we've got to focus on the basics to get things up to a good standard. So it has to be a top priority to do something about that and shift the dial at pace. We'll start with University Hospitals of Morecambe Bay because it's our most distressed trust and because it's coming up for a significant milestone early next year. So early next year, the NHSE will make a decision on whether Morecambe Bay should stay at soft 4 or whether it should move up to soft 3. And your recommendation as a board will be a major consideration in that decision. Now, the decision is ostensibly about Morecambe Bay. Are they good enough to make the cut? Will improvement be sustainable? But make no mistake, the decision is also about us, the ICB. Are we good enough to help them make the cut? And can we help them build on the improvement, stabilise and kick on to soft 2? We don't want to be a traditional regulator that sits on the sidelines, observes and takes copious notes. Remember that sort of South African proverb that I've been pushing hard. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So we're working on the principle that we are all in this together. So we'll roll up our sleeves and work alongside Morecambe Bay. And this will involve probably an 18 to 24 month partnership to get Morecambe Bay to Soft 2, with a package of support still to be worked through in detail, but it's likely to include an improvement director, an organisational development programme, top team mentoring, and some stretching accountability mechanisms. So the idea is that we agree that with Morecambe Bay and agree it with NHSE in advance before we come back to this board for your approval. And we'll adopt a similar approach for the other trusts in due course as well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is system productivity. You don't need reminding, it's in the papers pretty much every day, but just remember the pressure the system is under, particularly running up to winter. We're still in the pandemic with rising COVID numbers. Long COVID is emerging as a serious challenge. Flu is on the horizon. Record numbers at A&E, challenging waiting lists, etc., etc. Remember all of that. And alongside that, primary care under severe pressure and the social care system really fragile. So that's the general picture. And despite all of those challenges, I think we remain very optimistic. There are loads of opportunities to secure a step change in productivity by working together and using the power of systems thinking. And it's easy to get consumed by the here and now because of all those real pressures, but we have to have an eye on the medium term. We've got to be looking at our position next financial year and the year after, where we can make a real difference. And James's paper will take you through some of those projects, so I don't intend to comment on those, but I think we've got to be pretty honest about where we are on those projects. At the moment, we've got pretty low levels of recurrent savings in the system. We've got some of those projects not yet properly set up. We have to get the right leaders to do these things well, and sometimes that takes a bit of time. And some of them have barely begun, but some of them are now underway and will make a big difference next year. Next item I thought I'd cover was the Integrated Care Partnership. So we had our second meeting of that last week. It went well. We're on course to complete a draft strategy by December. It will be pretty basic and pretty high level, reflecting the timescales. And over the next few years, we can make that smarter and more sophisticated going forward. The hard yards for that needs to be done at place. One of the issues actually that came up from last Tuesday's meeting of the ICP was data and digital. And I think as we discussed it more, we realised that actually it's not really about data, it's about insight. That's the really crucial thing, because we've got loads and loads of information there, but it's making sense of it, understanding the patterns, identifying the key things and taking action to do it. So it's really about, there's quite a healthy field of study now in health and social care around predictive analytics. That's what are the patterns and what can you do early to stop things happening later, etc., etc. And we need to use that a lot more. So it's not really about data, it's about insight and it's about predictive analytics. I thought I'd just say a few things about place. We have now appointed all the place-based directors, as you know. Only 2 of the 4 are in post now. The other 2 should be in post by Christmas. So it has taken a bit of time to get these things up and running. Just want to be upfront about that. So there is a little bit of an issue that we need to address where we as a ICB at the sort of regional level, if you like, are racing ahead for understandable reasons, and there's a bit of catch-up required at the place level. So I want to be upfront about that. There are workshops planned for the next few weeks involving all 4 place-based directors and some of our team to start working through what's going to happen at place, what happens at regional level, etc., etc. So we'll come back in the new year with a full progress report on that. They've got Sir David Pearson doing a bit of work with the teams. He's done a lot of work in this space for the NHS nationally, so he's a significant very, very insightful person with good experience. Just a couple of other smaller things. I attended, actually it was the day after our board meeting, the National NHS Leadership event the following day, where they had the full leadership team from the NHS there. It was all the usual stuff. It was covered actually rather quickly in the HSJ, even though it was Chatham House rules. It appeared the same day in the HSJ. But the top issues were obviously winter, the budget, and there was a lot of talk of the North Bristol model around A&E admissions. It's a way of sort of spreading the risk across the hospital. Our trusts have done it from time to time. It's not really a long-term solution. It's more of a thing you can do for a short period. But you'll probably hear some discussion around the North Bristol model. They had the chief nurse presenting at the event, who was very good, and they clearly handled it quite well there. Their numbers were far more challenging than ours, by the way. I think they had around 800 beds in that hospital, with nearly 500 not meeting medical criteria to reside. So that's the same number we have across our entire system, to put it in perspective. Health Service Journal, I attended a meeting, a summit in Manchester last Friday, where it was basically a summit on integrated care. A lot of discussion around what's needed in the social care space and the need for a long-term approach. I think that was probably one of the key things. I also went to a dinner on Saturday evening with CARN, which is the Caribbean and African sort of organisation, where we actually won an award for health equity for the brilliant vaccination programme that was done across Lancashire and South Cumbria, so good news on that. And the final thing, I just thought I'd mention Whalley. I visited Whalley last week, so this is a big, it was a mental health hospital to begin with. It's currently being owned and operated by Merseycare, but it will be transferring to LSCFT going forward. It's a huge site with a lot of good estate there. It's a great opportunity for LSCFT to do some good stuff there, and there are plans that are pretty well developed there. But it's also a massive opportunity for the system. I mean, we could be doing the likes of a dementia village or an ageing well community. So I think there are some fabulous opportunities that we need to look at for Whalley going forward. So I just thought, with that insight and data, I thought I'd end with a quote. The price of light is less than the cost of darkness. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Excellent report, thank you. Obviously, as we go through the agenda, we can talk more about the finance with Sam, the transformation programmes with James, and the performance with and winter issues with Maggie. Any other points in response to Kevin's? I've got Jane, then Debbie to start with, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kevin. It's a really helpful kind of snapshot of the key issues. I just wanted to challenge you a little bit, and in fact challenge all of us, really, because I think what you said at the beginning around trust performance was that it means that we have to focus on the basics and we can't do the clever stuff. And I actually wonder whether that's right. I think for years, if we look at Morecambe Bay, they've struggled, you know, with equivalence of soft for special measures and so on. And I imagine that what they've done is the same things every time in terms of action plans to try and address it. And I wonder whether what we should be thinking now in terms of trust performance is the clever stuff. In other words, where can we innovate? Where can we work, you know, as a provider collaborative, smarter? Where can we work as a board and as a system to try and address these performance issues? Because off the top of my head, one of the challenges has been getting talented people to come and work in our region. So that ought to be something we can look at together. What makes it more attractive to come and work across this patch, that kind of thing. So I just want, so it's just a gentle challenge to all of our thinking, really, that we need to be innovative, I think, even though it feels like we're just doing the basics. I'm not sure whether doing what we've always done will be the answer.
Look, I think that's a good challenge, and I think you're right. But at the same time, we can't do everything, so we need to prioritise, don't we? And it's also right that we need to put the foundations in place so that it's sustainable, because one of the problems Moreton Bay has had in the past, it's moved up and then it's moved down pretty quickly. But that doesn't mean we think about those issues in a different way and look for new approaches to put those foundations in place. So I think it's a good challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think it's a brilliant report, and I think it's a very frank, honest and open report, which is exactly what we need really to give us the assurance that the risks, the issues, the challenges are spotted, and assurance around what's in place. I suppose it picks up a bit on Jane's point. So paragraph 3.3, when we're talking about how to best improve trust performance and the huge significant challenges that are there, there's mentioned that there'd been some talk of moving to a group structure, but that had been discounted because it can't happen with poorly performing trusts. And I just found that quite interesting and just wanted to understand that a bit better, please, if I could. Because I know from an education perspective, whilst I wouldn't sort of wish a restructure on organisations lightly, I do know from other sectors that when you've got poor performance, actually coming together as a group can accelerate that improvement and is actually what's needed to get that pace. So it's probably very different in NHS, but I just wanted, with it having been mentioned, just to understand that. And then the other point, if I could quickly, 4.9, the rollout of the virtual wards. I'm just wondering, with the significant ramp up in numbers around that, how we're engaging and hearing from patients and public who've accessed them so far about what the views are and the value of them, and how we're taking on board that feedback, given that we're accelerating the programme so quickly. Just really keen that we learn from what people think about them around access and experience as we start to rapidly increase them.
Okay, great, two great issues actually, thanks. And I'll invite David to come in on the virtual wards after I've answered the first point, if that's okay. I think the logic in where I was coming from is, do you remember British Leyland? I rest my case, my lord. British Leyland brought a lot of failing brands together, and what you had was a failing company. And why did that happen? Poor leadership, poor process, poor management. The second point would be over 70% of mergers and acquisitions fail to meet expectations globally. Public sector tends to do it poorer than private sector as well, so the failure rate's probably higher. So I think there are big risks in bringing together challenged organisations to do that. So that's why it comes back to sequencing and priorities, getting the foundations in place, getting the good processes, which, by the way, the provider collaborative are on. There's a whole load of stuff around quality systems and that, and making those consistent across all 5 trusts, etc., etc. So that's all about putting the foundations in place. We don't want to hang around either. It would be the final point here. We do want to get the conditions in place to make sure the risk involved in bringing organisations together then is much lower, and of course that directly affects the patient and the taxpayer, etc. So that was the logic around it. It was just saying, can't do everything at once. We need to do this in a speedy, a swift way, but in the right sequence, if that makes sense. David, on virtual wards.
Can I just add to that first point? I can think of 2 examples very easily within the Northwest where bringing trusts together has made things actually significantly worse, unfortunately. So it may work for education, that's fantastic. It doesn't really help health unless you've got healthy organisations coming together. And at the moment, I think there is going to be that partnership work, and we can see it working so very well within the provider collaborative. But there will be a journey, but it may take a bit longer.
The teaser that, David, are you going to name who you had in mind when you said it?
It's a public meeting. Do you want me to? I'll tell you afterwards. So the virtual wards. So as we've rolled out that, working with providers and with community with virtual wards, we have been going on a journey with the providers and particularly with the clinicians, because they were quite concerned about this new way of working. And what's really helped them is the patient stories. So we've actually we did a number of Northwest events and events just with some of the providers alone. But the stories such as a woman who described the fact that she wasn't very well and she was worried she was going to have to come into hospital. And she said, well, actually, because the virtual ward, I can be at home and I can look after my husband. And that's the sort of thing, well, that's it, isn't it? You suddenly see the whole value there. So we are collecting some of those stories, and it is really important we get the feedback from the patients. But it's a win-win for so many people.
Thanks, David. We've got David Blacklock, then Kevin, then Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. So my point is on point number 2 of the report, the cancer performance, and obviously it's not a great picture, and I suppose my mind always goes to the experience of the patients that are waiting, as you would expect, and so I suppose I'm seeking some assurance that we're communicating effectively with people whilst they're waiting, because waiting an extra day, never mind several weeks for treatment when you suspect you have cancer, or you're waiting for treatment and diagnosis is absolutely excruciating. So I just wonder, what are our organisations, what are the trusts doing to make sure that patients are really kept informed about delays and when they're likely to be seen and so on?
Thank you, David. I think we're perhaps best collecting these up for your item later, are we?
We can do, or we can answer that.
If you can do it now, yeah, fine, yeah.
So although Maggie does the performance report, I'm the cancer SRO. So you're quite right, and I flagged up in the last 2 meetings we have had some concerns about cancer waits and the rising number of patients waiting, partly because of the increasing demand. And I'd imagine that Kevin may want to speak in a minute or two about this as well. However, we've worked with the providers. We've got 2 providers, as you can see from Kevin's report, where in fact there were significant numbers of patients waiting, particularly for lower GI cancers, lower bowel cancers, and for some skin cancers, where we've seen real increases in the number of patients being referred 25% or more above what we were in 2020. And so what we've done, both of those organisations, what they've done is a number of pieces of work. First of all, they've developed a recovery plan because they need to put more capacity in, and they've moved capacity around. But also, they're making sure that those patients who are waiting longer are waiting safely. So they're kind of safety netting them, they're going back to them and saying that this is what's happening, checking the patients are okay. And so that's something I think that we're picking up in the quality committee in about 2 weeks' time, some of that work. So that we go through the quality committees. You're quite right to raise it as a concern, but as far as we're aware, although patients are waiting longer, and you're quite right, 1 more day is 1 more day longer than you really want to wait if you're thinking you might have cancer. The fact is we are ensuring that as much as possible that they're waiting safely. Kevin, did you want to come in there at all?
Yeah, thanks, David. Just in terms of cancer, every patient on the cancer waiting list has what we call a harm review, which is a review undertaken by the clinicians, and there is direct communication with the patient. So the waiting lists are not where we want them to be. There is a recovery plan in place, and the numbers are actually starting to come down as we speak. But those harm reviews are undertaken, and it's the absolute priority of every clinician across the system to make sure that those patients are waiting safely.
Kevin, do you want to, well, you've got the mic, do you want to come to you then? I'll go to Sarah, then Roy.
Yeah, it was a couple of points, if I may. Firstly, if I can just counsel us in terms of some of the language that we've used around the table, in terms of sort of failing trusts, etc. I think it's not helpful, and I think some of the language is inappropriate. If you look at every acute trust in the country at the moment, they are under significant pressure, be that through the emergency pathways, be that through the recovery from COVID, cancer, elective recovery. And in fact, if you look at the performance statistics of our trusts, they are either on or above the national average, with the exception of cancer, and we've now got that recovery plan in place. So I would please just caution in terms of some of the language that's being used around the table. I then absolutely agree with sort of Jane. I don't think this is about organisational restructuring, but I think it is about fundamentally looking at how services are delivered across Lancashire and South Cumbria, and I think we can get different solutions. And I am really hopeful now with the ICB, the ICS in place, that we've got that strategic oversight that will allow us to come together and make those big strategic decisions that are going to be required about how and where and why services are delivered across our patch. that we've not had the ability to take over the many years. Because I suspect if you talk to any of the provider organisations in our patch, they would absolutely recognise that the current distribution of services is not optimal. And we absolutely want to have those conversations about how and where those services are delivered. So I think that should be the focus rather than organisational structures for the next few years.
Thank you, Kevin. Very clear. I agree with that. Sarah then, Roy then Ibby, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to Jane's point as well on basics versus transformation. And I don't disagree, and I think it is important we have some fundamental transformation, and that builds on what Kevin has just said. But actually, often the challenge is that we don't deliver the basics well, we don't deliver the fundamentals of care. You could take any condition, long-term conditions, cancer, other conditions, and there's a plethora of evidence of how to treat it. And what we don't do very well is consistently implement that evidence base in practice, often because of the way we're set up or because of staffing challenges. So for me, transformation is actually how do we enable our frontline teams to consistently deliver safe, basic care and deliver the evidence base. If we did that well, consistently, we'd be in the top quartile for outcomes in many, many things. And that's as important in transformation as a whole service redesign. And that doesn't just apply in health. There's evidence in social work that actually it's all about practice, practice, practice. And if social workers are equipped to deliver effective practice, you get better outcomes and you actually eventually save money as well. So I think we've got to get that balance right. But for a lot of our organisations, it's how do we deliver safe and fundamental and effective care on a consistent basis.
Thanks, Chair. I'm aware that a national letter went out about 5 days ago to trusts, Tier 1 and Tier 2 providers, I should say, regarding waiting list management. And that talks about validating patients, make sure patients are validated correctly and in time so that they are aware. They have to be contacted, I think that's part of the letter. I think, Kevin, you'll be aware of that. To make sure that they are aware that they are on the list, where they are on the list. I think it's really important for us to know that as a board, that that's happening. And Kevin's absolutely right. We shouldn't criticise trusts all the time. He's absolutely right in saying that. You know, they're receiving these letters, these national letters. They're giving guidance about what to do, as if they don't know what to do themselves. But you know, they're given guidance on what to do and to validate those patients. And I think it's really important that we know that. So thanks, Kevin, for raising that, and you, David, as well, for talking about, because cancer's in there as well. It's from the letter. So I think it's from Jim Mackey and Callie Palmer, who are both leads for elective care and for cancer care. And as I say, it refers to that to those waiting list management in that letter. Thanks.
Just for completeness, if any board members want to see the detail of the correspondence, we'll distribute it to you. Kevin, to come back on that, and then to Ibby, please.
Yeah, just to look, we hit the 104 weeks target. The trusts are on trajectory to meet the 78 weeks target as well. One of the innovations that was actually developed in Langs Teaching Hospital was the chatbot, which actually is going to feature in the Northwest MP's briefing today with the GM who leads on elective care. That made a big difference and is actually being rolled out across the region and is featured nationally as well. So there's some really good innovations coming through.
Thanks, David. Just going back to cancer, and I should know the answer to this, but I don't. How much is that backlog as a result of the pandemic and late presentation that's now kind of coming through and is just overwhelming many parts of the NHS? And how much is it just an increase in the prevalence of those types of cancers? Because I think, depending on the answer, the capacity planning will look very different over the short and the longer term. And I'm just wondering, do we have the evidence to know what our capacity needs to look like over the next 18 months, 3 years?
I think that's a really important point, Ibby, and the answer is yes, we do. So we've got a significant backlog now that is a consequence of activity that was stopped through the pandemic. But what we've seen post-pandemic is that referral rates are significantly higher in certain presentations, particularly in colorectal and in skin. you know, we're talking about 20% higher pre and post pandemic. So it's a matter of both. So the work that we're now doing is twofold. Firstly, we put on some additional extra capacity to remove the backlog, and that backlog will be removed by the time we get into March next year. The figures are already starting to come down. But it really then touches, I think, on Jane's point. There is then a fundamental issue in terms of long-term capacity and demand for cancer services across Lancashire and South Cumbria. And we need to do a root and branch review that I know David is very keen to support in terms of that capacity and demand across the providers in Lancashire and South Cumbria. And we're very keen to engage in that and to support and be supported by David to undertake that work.
Thanks, Kevin. David.
So if we just go back to part of your question, which was how we're thinking, if you go back to before the pandemic, we could see that the number of referrals for cancer was rising, but not necessarily the number of cancers. And it's always been a longer-term ambition from Professor Mike Richards initially, that more patients should be referred along the 2-week wait pathway. And they are, which is fantastic. But we've now, and as Kevin's described, we're seeing that kind of stepwise change, which means we have to redesign our pathways. We've done that particularly for some of the colorectal work, so that some patients, if they're referred, we can do some relatively simple tests on them, which can be done in primary care. And if they're negative, you don't need to come and see a hospital doctor. So we're beginning to do that. But it is looking at that wider, what capacity do we need, and how we can redesign those pathways. But stepping back as an ICB, working with the provider collaborative to say, let's have a Lancs and South Cumbria solution, so we can ensure that we have those sustainable cancer services for the next few years. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Tracy, then Jeff.
Thanks, David. I just wanted to ask a specific point around COVID vaccinations. I note from the minutes and from what you said about the award that you received, we were expecting some data at some point around take-up amongst BME communities. I think that would be really useful for us as a voluntary sector to understand more about, particularly at the moment as we're going into kind of the booster programme being rolled out. What is the take-up amongst communities? So that was quite a specific point I wanted to ask. But I also just wanted to pick up on some of the conversations around basics versus transformation, and really, I suppose, again, as well around that kind of partnership working and, accepting the point that mergers are something very different, but actually I don't want to run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit, talking about not coming together, not working collaboratively, because I actually think there's so much that can be done in that. And I don't think transformation is mutually exclusive from the basics. And I'm seeing some examples of this. And just to give you one, I visited Blackpool Teaching Hospitals yesterday, and I went to the Transfer of Care Hub along with my Advice Services Manager and my Health Services Manager, with a view to us looking at how we can do some innovative things around people who are medically fit to leave hospital actually being able to return to their homes, particularly their homes, rather than looking at social care, because that really isn't our forte. And just looking at some of the kind of data around Blackpool in particular, 1 in 4 people who come through ED are living in poverty in Blackpool. And a lot of the conversations that we had yesterday were around how many people are not able to return to their homes because they can't afford to heat them and they can't afford to buy food at the moment, and how many of the families of those patients are saying it would be unfair to send them home. And I think, judging by talking to the staff, there's quite a feel for that and quite a lot of that. So I think that is real innovation, what we're trying to build into the system. It's something that we're looking at in terms of, can we put staff on wards who are very much based around kind of social prescribing model, social welfare advice, that actually can bridge some of those gaps that prevent people from going home. So I don't want to lose some of that innovation that we're really, I see us starting to develop. And I know there's, I've spoken to Maggie, and we're going to have wider conversations about how we do this on a kind of wider footprint. But what we're talking about in Blackpool really is something quite different, whilst all the basics are still there to get right. But let's not forget that actually we can be quite innovative during this time, and I think we need to be.
Yeah, I think we need to be, don't we? Because the numbers of not meeting medical criteria to reside are increasing and probably will continue to do so over these coming months. And the average length of stay of those patients is also increasing as well. So we need to be looking at everything that can make a difference, to be frank. Totally agree. On the vaccination, that's why we won the award, because there were very high take-ups in the BME community. And it was done by teams who understood those communities really well and used the mainstream mechanisms there are in those communities rather than conventional NHS approaches. That was the beauty of the whole thing. What we will do is I'll pick it up with my business manager to come back and let you know what the figures were. I'll copy it to all the board for the vaccination programme today and where we are with the current booster campaign. We're still at the foothills of that. It's due to be completed in December, January time. So yeah, I think we are trying to run ahead of the NHS timetable as well on that, but I can cover that by correspondence.
Abdul, do you want to add anything on the vaccination?
I think just to follow on really from Kevin, the current position really, I think we've got probably about 5 or 6 weeks to go in terms of the autumn booster campaign. The data actually shows really that the older 65 plus uptake is good, and the at-risk groups really is very positive. It's slightly less encouraging in terms of our health and social care workforce in terms of COVID uptake. It is, it is on the lower side in terms of how our staff are actually taking up the booster. So I think there's further work to be done there. In terms of ethnic minorities, which was the specific question really asked by my colleague, the uptake is not as high as we would want it to be for the autumn booster, and we are doing proactive messaging. For example, in Blackburn and Darwin, we are, I'm doing multiple languages kind of messaging in terms of social media, and obviously I've been on radio as well. But we also have community voice champions who are actually getting the message across around COVID and flu across multiple languages, and we are engaging with our community champion colleagues. But there looks as though really there is going to be, within diverse communities, a level of reticence to come forward. So I think, so I think that's the indicative issue, but we are pushing very, very hard just to give the assurance really in terms of actually getting the messages across and making the offer as accessible as possible in terms of outreach work. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdul. Very helpful. And Jeff?
Thank you, Chair. Kevin, you asked if your report is suitable. I think it's great. I think it's very usable, very readable, and it's great in a public meeting that we can use it out with other groups. So that's the answer to your question. But I wanted to make a couple of points and ask a couple of questions very quickly. The cancer audit stuff that David mentioned from Mike Richards, we were encouraged as GPs to have a low index of suspicion. And you can get that from the hospital data and see how many referrals you've done, how many cancers. And you're aiming to be relatively low, but there is the point that you could refer too many. And we're not encouraged to think like that, but you can look at that from a practice point of view. And the key data for me is how many cancers in your practice didn't go through the 2-week pathway. So if you're not getting many cancers out with that 2-week pathway, you're doing well and you're at the right spot. There's a sweet spot. So you can refer too many. That might not be a nationally popular opinion, but that's my opinion, and I think you can do that at a practice level and hone your experience. The Bristol stuff, we did something like this in Arrow Park 40 years ago when it opened, and it was chaos. It was absolute a nightmare. So just be careful if you do it. Think it through carefully, because it wasn't great. 2 questions which may be answered later in other parts of the meeting, which was provoked by your talk around performance, Kevin. We have evidence of delayed discharge, people fit for discharge in beds. But have we got the evidence about individual ward performance? Just anecdotally, I feel different wards perform quite differently rather than whole hospitals. So I don't know whether you've got a view on that, Kevin, but I feel there are some wards that perform much better than others. I certainly see that in my experience in the past, and I just wonder whether that would inform the mechanism for improving the discharge process. Happy to discuss that out with the meeting. And finally, you talked about improving the trust performance like at Morecambe Bay. Is that a management-led improvement programme, or are the clinicians involved? So they're my questions. Happy to answer them later.
I'll take that last one.
Yeah, I think David might want to come in on more detail there, but it's got to be both.
Right.
Is the simple answer on Morecambe Bay, and frankly, all the trusts. And it depends on the challenges they're facing, of course.
So for Morecambe Bay in particular, because it's in SOF 4 and it has some national oversight, then in fact they actually benefit from not just getting the basics right, but getting the best of the basics. And so when it comes around to the team being developed, they're actually doing that multidisciplinary team working. So they've often typically got a triumvirate at the top of each of their clinical directorates, which they've developed. And they're actually doing that kind of training together. So you've got managers and clinicians learning together and developing together, which obviously is the ideal way because it brings those two different mindsets together. So that's been very helpful. But to reinforce Sarah's comment, the fact is by being in SOF 4, you often get the best and the latest. And there is some suggestion that maybe Morecambe Bay should be sharing of what they've learned across the whole of the ICB.
So will we be involved clinically?
So what we're doing, and I think Kevin highlighted in his report, we need to be working very closely with the regional team, with the national team, and of course with our colleagues in Morecambe Bay to ensure that we are in the position to be weight bearing as we go through the winter and into next year, so that we are able to take on the mantle of developing Morecambe Bay further from SOF 3 into SOF 2 as their ambition is.
Thanks, David. On the ward level data around discharge, I'll ask Maggie to pick up later in the report. Thank you, Jeff. And so, very positive about the report, Kevin. I think it's an excellent way for us to start the meeting and open up the discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, just picking up on Kevin's point about Worley and the old Calderstones, I think it would be very interesting for the board for us to understand the trust plans more and how it can contribute to the system. So when the time's right, perhaps you'll come back and present here.
Yeah, absolutely, not a problem at all, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Right, Sam. Oh no, it's not. Sorry. No, I'm not. I do apologise, Sarah. The patient story, citizens' voice, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Today's video is Stephen and Jean are going to share with us. They live in Fleetwood. Their experience when, unfortunately, he was admitted to intensive care. And I think the focus of today's video is probably less about the reason why he was admitted to intensive care, but they more very openly share their experiences, both from his as the patient, but also the impact on the wider family of being admitted into intensive care. And I think particularly going into what is going to be a very, very challenging winter for all of our acute trusts, and there will be more demand on intensive care beds. I think some of the themes they bring out just illustrate how some of the more wider holistic care that is needed gets even harder when staff are under so much pressure. Thank you, Chair.
I came back from holiday. I felt progressively ill the following week, and culminating in the Friday morning, I woke up. I had a dreadful temperature and couldn't breathe. I couldn't get my breath. So Jean rang 111, who sent us to the local GP on an emergency appointment, who then sent us down. He said to us at the time, he said it's going to be quicker for me quicker for Jean to take me to the hospital than him to call an ambulance, because I obviously needed to get there urgently. So he wrote us a letter. He tried to contact the hospital but couldn't get through. Wrote us a letter. Jean dropped me off at A&E, and that was the start of my journey. I went in with thinking I'd got a cold or some flu, and ended up unconscious on a ventilator for about 11 days with Legionella, which is quite a serious illness.
We used to sit in this relative's room. There was just this one occasion. Stephen was still very poorly at this stage, and there was a family there, and the son had to make decision to switch.
Off his father's life support machine.
But what got me was the amount of people in there, and I thought, we're not meant to be here. This isn't all for us, really. So I just said to my sons that I think we'll go and wait on the corridor.
It needs to be separated really from the rest of people.
Yeah.
People should have some privacy at that time. It's very emotional time, obviously, for everyone involved. Amazingly inspirational staff at Blackpool. I used to hate to see the physiotherapists coming towards me, Nikki, who frightened me to death, making me do all things that I didn't want to do at all because I felt really rough. But I do appreciate why she did them at the time now. And some of the other staff there was one, a Polish nurse, who was so inspirational, Justina. She just really helped with the recovery. She again made me do things that I particularly didn't want to do, but I understand now why she did that.
Thank you, Chair. So I won't say a lot. I mean, a big thank you to Stephen and Jean for sharing, what was a very moving experience. I think you heard there, it brought out a few key issues that we know are challenges. So the initial challenge of getting to A&E and, it really was a life-threatening situation and didn't call an ambulance. The relatives had to take them, and we know that our ambulance services are under immense pressure. And I think, we touched on before the Bristol model and the fact that we might be put under pressure to put more patients in areas where you wouldn't, and that's then why separate areas to deliver really difficult news will get harder and harder for our staff when we've got overcrowded A&E departments, overcrowded wards and overcrowded HDUs. So I don't think any staff would choose to deliver news like that in a more public forum, but that is the reality of as we put more patients into our acute trusts where they really haven't got the capacity for. These are the consequences. But I think it does show the impact on a whole family when somebody has a very serious illness and ends up in intensive care. I also think, though, they were very open about the impact individual members of staff had on them, the exemplary care, despite all the pressures that they did receive. And, of course, Stephen is with us today, so, a big thank you to the teams at Blackpool Hospital as well on behalf of Stephen and Jean. Thank you, Chair.
Any other observations, please, Debbie?
Thanks, David. I find, obviously this is the second patient story that we've had, and they're really moving, obviously, and they're very insightful as well. I just think for the maximum benefit, I sort of sit here and think I want to get beyond empathy and feeling really uncomfortable about it and how unsatisfactory it is, to sort of be in a place where as a board we ask ourselves a question about, can we do anything differently? Can we decide anything differently that would pick up on the themes that have come out? So I think you're absolutely right, Sarah, in pulling out those challenges around 111 triage and people being in a place where they're having to take the loved ones at speed themselves, and how unacceptable that is and how uncomfortable we are. And then similarly that point about not having space, so kind of my challenge to us is, well, can we actually do anything differently as a result of it? Because otherwise I feel a bit uncomfortable. I feel a bit passive that we're kind of saying, oh, it's really difficult and it's going to get worse, and can we do anything that's more proactive around it, really? And can we support any of the teams or the trust to do that?
Got Roy, then Kevin, please.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Debbie. Some of those reflections I think some of us will recognise, actually, and certainly with regards to transport into hospital, I've had two cases just recently of near where I live, of an elderly lady who I knew quite well who slipped on a wet road. She was 84, she had a fractured neck of femur, and a local car had to take her to hospital. Somebody stopped and actually picked her up and took her because there was apparently a 6-hour wait for the ambulance, even though she was still on the road, lying on the road in the wet. A dreadful experience, I suppose, that we will all perhaps recognise in other areas. Also, a man fell down some steps, an elderly man fell down some steps and cut his head really badly. They were waiting for an ambulance and somebody else stopped in a car and took him to hospital. we know and we recognise the pressures on the ambulance service, but I'm just wondering, Chair, and of course to you, Debbie, as well, I was just wondering if it might be worth we asked NWAS to come along to this meeting at some stage to perhaps give us an update on their position with regard to ambulance. We can all read what's happening, but you know, we only hear through particular patient stories or through individual experience about what is happening within that service. And as I say, we all recognise the pressures, but I'm just wondering if it might be worth we do that at some stage, so that we can hear that at first hand, and perhaps ask some questions, you know, relevant questions. Clearly, we don't want that to be, you know, difficult for the ambulance service, but I think it's important that we know and understand what the position is. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Roy. It's a good suggestion, Kevin. I think we'll organise it.
Yeah, could I just, yeah, we can do that. NWS are, you know, they're under real pressures, you know, in terms of handovers, response times, but they are performing well nationally. But we'll get Darren along with the chair, and yeah, I think it's a good idea.
And Kevin, then Sheena, please.
Thanks, David. I think what the story, I think it points to two things. It was a really moving story, but it wasn't so much about the clinical care, it was about the communication and how we communicate and the experience that goes round. And I have to say, Blackpool and all our providers have absolutely outstanding bereavement and end-of-life services, and it just shows how important those services are, and we need to make sure those services are available 24/7 comprehensively for all of our patients who come into our hospitals. But we do have outstanding services, and I have to say the work Blackpool have done in terms of bereavement and end-of-life care is really, they need to be complimented on it.
Thank you. Got Sheena, then Chris.
Yeah, just reflecting on what Debbie was saying about the kind of how do we make sure we bring threads through. So an offer, David and Kevin, is that we work through the Quality Committee about how we start to think about our forward agenda with our board programme, how we might pull themes through so that we get that kind of sense of an oversight and a thread through things. So, and Debbie and I have actually had some conversations last week around how do we work in partnership with the patient and citizen experience bit. So we'll work together and actually think about how do we make sure that that's kind of themed, and maybe linking into themes that we might be, as I said, using with the board programme going forward.
Very good, thanks, Sheena.
Thank
you. Chris?
Thank you, Chair. I think my reflection was the power of the patient or service user voice, and not forgetting that. And so I reflect back on our service user and carer councils that we've got at place, and really, I suppose the challenge for us all in health and social care is making sure that when we talk about the day-to-day improvements, the transformation schemes, is really taking that patient voice in with them, and making sure that we're learning the lessons and not thinking what is right from a professional perspective without taking in that carer voice. Really important.
Very good, thank you. Chris, Jeff.
Thank you, Chair. Two things. First of all, I work with the ambulance service every weekend when I'm on call, and I can't tell you how professional and supportive they are of me and my colleagues. So this isn't a reflection on the ambulance service, this is a reflection on the situation we're in. But they have transformed the way they provide care and support to us compared to, I won't use the 40-year analogy again, I've just said it, but you know, when I was a young lad, we had to go out to every heart attack before the ambulance would transport them. Total nonsense. So it's very streamlined, very professional, very effective when they're there. The point I wanted to make was, from this story, is things always go wrong at the interface. That's where the complaints come from. That's where patients run into trouble, and that's where we get sued and the like. It's always the interface, and this interface was patient to 111, 111 to GP, GP ambulance, car to A&E, and actually what we need is less interfaces, less handoffs, and a more streamlining, a more perfect way of getting patients to the right place first time. And that's my comment, and I think that would improve a lot of this stuff.
Thank you, Jeff. So I think Debbie's point about picking out the themes is key to this, and how Sheena says that we'll do that. But you know, that's a common one that we can anticipate in every story that we see, how one part of the system connects with the other. And I think in our system we're uniquely placed to be able to look at all the different moving parts and how they come together. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. Excellent. Now, Sam.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I think it's actually quite good to be looking at the financial paper after the discussion we've just had. And I think not just the patient story, but also some of the earlier discussions around how pressured the system is we're working in, because it is really pressured and we've got massive operational challenges, which is obviously impacting on our finances. I'm not going to go through the paper. I want to just pull some things out, but hopefully what you'll see in the paper this time is that this isn't just reporting where we are, but starts to move into and what are we doing about it, and what are the actions that we need to take, because we need to take a number of actions. I think what we're seeing, aren't we, nationally, is this picture of real challenge financial future outlook, really. And we're going to get the budget in November, which will talk about some of the public finances, and we can expect that this is not going to get easier next year, I think. I think we can expect further ongoing challenges. And so what's really, really important is that we're acting now on the things that we are seeing going forward, not just for this year, but for a number of years to come. And we have already done a lot of work on this, and we're positioning ourselves, I think, quite well as a system in terms of knowing where we can go for some of these things and some of the things we can do. So if we think later on in the agenda, we've got the paper from James around some of the transformational work and some of the programmes. They are based on real evidence and real diagnostics of where we know we are wasting money. You know, and we can't be affording to waste any money now. We need to be moving forward and making sure that every single penny counts and every single penny is improving the quality of and outcomes for our population. Now, what's really good about those programmes when we get into them is they're not about slashing and burning and cutting money. They are about improving quality, whether it's get it right first time or getting quality bank and agency resolved. You know, we are looking at a number of things that will drive the quality. So they are going to be really, really important that we take it forward in that way. I think when we look at where we are post-COVID, and it's the national picture as well, productivity is a massive issue. We've fallen drastically on our productivity indicators. We've got more staff than we had, 10% more staff, I think, since pre-COVID, and less activity. And so we've got some way to go. I think the expectation next year as we move forward will be, how do we address some of those things? How do we get to where we need to get to, not with more money, but from the resources we've got, and look at some of that productivity? How do we work with our partners and our voluntary sector and other sectors to make this really real? And it's going to be really important we do this well. What's great is under Kevin and David's leadership and this board's leadership is, you know, we were only born in July, but at that very first July board meeting, we talked about a number of controls that we needed to take, and they are really important. So we know the challenges, but we've got to take the action that is within our gift to get right. And at the moment, if I could go through the finance report, but I'm not going to go through it in detail because it's just a step on from last month, really. It just progressively a little bit worse than it was last month. And what we can see is the biggest thing that's worrying me in there is the level of non-recurrent savings that we are delivering. We have to get this right. So the steps that the paper talks about really is that what we've been doing as part of month 6 is doing a real deep dive into the finances of all of our organisations, including our own ICB. And you'll see from the paper we're 43 million adrift at month 6. That's halfway through the year. You don't need to be an accountant to work out halfway through the year that that's going to be a bad position at the end of the year if we do nothing else. So I think, you know, we've got a real recovery plan around the ICB finances. I can talk about that if you want me to, but we've taken a number of actions. But what's been really helpful is I think as a system we're coming together to work together. So yes, we've got a role around accountability, holding to account and being accountable for our finances. That doesn't mean we're the regulator, as Kevin mentioned earlier. What we've actually put in place as part of a month 6 review of our finances is some peer-to-peer review with each other. So what's been great is some of our directors of finance have been working together in a peer-to-peer way to look at what's going on, to identify what that risk is. That risk is still you know, at least 70 million for the end of the year, but there are things that we can do. So what the paper describes is that deep dive that we're doing at month 6, but then also what are the next steps? And I think what we're asking is for a recovery plan by the end of November from every organisation that then starts to ensure that we've got all those controls in place. There are board declarations around that we're taking every action to make the non-recurrent SIPs recurrent, and that we're using every bit of fortuitous opportunity this year to balance off what we can as we move towards the end of the year, whilst we put the transformation programmes in to give us real sustainability. Because the only way we can really improve the outcomes for our population and the only way we can really drive quality is to have complete ownership and autonomy in the way we work, and we won't get that if we don't have financial sustainability. So this is really, really important. So we're doing, I think, all the right things. This board has taken the right actions. We're looking at the right programmes. We can't go fast enough. I wish we could. We can't go any faster than we're going. But we need those recovery plans back from every organisation to say, how are we going to deliver this for the end of the year? So that's all I was going to say, but I'm happy to take any questions on the paper.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you, and thanks, Sam. That was a really candid assessment, I think, and that was really helpful. I think it was much more probably realistic than the report. I was reading the report, and it felt over-optimistic, frankly, because I'm personally not seeing much movement from when we started these conversations 4 or 5 months ago. And it'd be very interesting to see what comes to you at the end of this month in terms of recovery plans. I suppose my question is, what's going to happen with those, and where do we go with them? Because they've almost got to deliver the savings, and yet there's no evidence that savings are forthcoming from within the constituent organisations at this point in time. Yeah. So if they don't come forward, where do we go then, basically? What is there a plan B in all of this?
Yeah, so when we get those plans back at the end of November, we've actually setting up our own governance internally in the ICB to review all those. We know we've talked about the Finance Committee, so that will take a role in that. We are having board-to-board meetings with each of the boards, and finance is playing out through those discussions, and it's a really important part of it. But we've got to continue to have that conversation. We need to see these coming back, and I don't know what consequences, if you're asking about consequences, the next steps are, but I think what we've got to start with is working together and making sure that we get those plans back. So they'll be reviewed by the Finance Committee, they'll be part of our board-to-boards, and actually I will be bringing back an update on that to this board in December.
So I think it's just wait and see, basically, but we've almost got to be doing something in December, I think. So, you know, I've used the word passive about things before. We're being relatively passive on this at this point in time. We need to move from passive to making sure that action is being taken and led by us, basically. Well, not led by us, but we are participating in a sort of cooperative approach.
Yeah, thank you. We've got Roy, Angie, Debbie.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for the report and your comments there are really frank and open assessment of where we are currently, so it's appreciated. And you referred to productivity in there, Sam, and that was also referred to in the Chief Exec's report earlier. And when I was looking at the paper and looking at the information within there, I looked again and I commented on this at another meeting about the run rate currently, and I think the productivity gains we are not getting, you know, we should expect are not coming as a result of those at that run rate, that particular run rate. So that's one thing that concerns me. The other thing, I suppose, a couple of things really, is one is about, and Jim's already spoke about this, is about the ability to meet the SIPs within the acute trusts. We had a discussion about that at our recent board-to-board meeting that we've referred to earlier. We'll probably continue to have those discussions at other board-to-board meetings as well. And my comment there was about the SIP being a bit backloaded towards the last 2 quarters of the year, or H2, I think we call them now. So I think that's something we need to have on our radar. Yeah. But the last thing I think from me is a proportion of our risk, I think, sits with each of the providers. And I'm talking about the ICB risk now, the system risk. And are we aware that there are any mitigations within those providers? Have they identified anything to cover that risk part of that risk, that system risk within their own organisation. I think that's really important that we know that, quite frankly, as an ICB board, because if that's not been mitigated for, then we would be, I expect, in a difficult situation later on in the year. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, so as part of the month 6 review that we've done, we've gone into absolutely every level of detail, as you can imagine. So understanding run rate, how things are profiled, savings in future. So that's given the real assessment of the risk we've got. Also identifying a number of mitigations has been part of that. Now, a lot of those, as I mentioned before, are non-recurrent, which, you know, we're using every fortuitous gain, slippage, technical adjustments, asset valuation to look at that. So there are mitigations, and that's what I can bring back in terms of being really clear about where we are and what the real risk is. I think the point that you make about the run rate and the non-recurrent delivery and using all of that non-recurrent delivery to deliver this year really is the key point. And this is where we need to get the recurrent plans from all of the boards in place for at least 3%, we said this year, of the SIP needed to be recurrent. And just to be really clear on this, you know, if we're looking at somewhere between a 70 to 100 million pound pressure in our system, with potentially another 100 million that's being delivered non-recurrently, and then you go into next year where we've got potentially further COVID funding coming out, you're getting into 200 or 300 million of pressure to start with. So this is why we absolutely need to get a grip of it now. And that's why, you know, you're absolutely right. And that's what month 6 review's been all about. And that's what these recovery plans need to cover. We want to see the rest of the mitigation that's got to be in there.
Angie, then Debbie, please.
Thank you. And absolutely echo Jim's points and amplify them, because we've been oversighting a worsening situation, and we have been incredibly passive in this, and I think we have to recognise that we have asked for and been given some assurances, but they haven't yet translated into real fundamental change. So I have a clarification, a question and an offer here.
Yeah.
So in terms of just clarification, and I'm sorry, Sam, I should know this, but according to the report, we had a planned overspend of about 18 million at this period anyhow, and we're £43 million adrift from that planned overspend. Can you just remind me whether that planned 18 million overspend was for the full year or just for this year, this point in the year, and whether the overspend was then going to be negated so we were living within our budget envelope?
Yeah. So on that first point, yes, absolutely. It's where we are now.
Yeah.
The profile is to bring that, the profile plan was to bring that back into balance by the end of the year. Yeah.
Super, thank you. In terms of a question, it to me as a board seems inevitable that we will overspend against our budget envelope at this point. What does that do in terms of our seeking to retain or improve from soft 3 as an ICB? Does that put us at risk of going into soft 4? So I'd like that answered, because I think we need to be very cognizant of that when we think about how we respond. And then in terms of something of an offer, going back to Kevin's point that, you know, if we want to go far, we need to do this together. We do already have quite a bit of information, as you've said, Sam, about where we can make those savings. In local government, we are much better at commissioning care in the communities at a lower price and for a shorter time with a greater outcome than the NHS. We would like to step in and support you to do that, because what happens when the NHS come in block book, they drive up prices and actually they reduce the availability of services. So that transfers costs onto us. So there's a win-win if we can get into that together and work proactively. We also have the Carnell-Farrer report, the Ruth Carnell report. She was involved in that, which we've had in the system for a number of years. There's a business case there that shows genuine cashable savings, and yet we haven't brought that forward, we haven't progressed that at all. So I think there are two specific areas where we can step in and work together and hopefully deliver some savings.
Yeah.
at pace, and there will be much more when you scratch the surface. So we just need to find a mechanism to bring local government into those conversations so that we can work together to deliver.
Thank you,
that.
Angie.
Thank
Very
you.
helpful indeed. Very helpful. Debbie, Sheena, Sarah.
Thanks, David. Thanks for the paper and the assurance and all of the actions that are being put in place. It's two questions really. So after the 6-month review process and the reforecasting that will happen, under 9.4 there's a range of sort of actions that are outlined where if a provider submits a forecast that basically says we need to reforecast because it's not been accurate so far and we can't deliver what we've said, there's a whole host of things that happen.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, could we or should we offer some of that now?
Yes.
And secondly, is there a risk, because nobody wants to be in a place where you're saying that you can't deliver what you'd hope to, is there a risk that providers might remain optimistic, and do we test that optimism through those conversations and sort of put that challenge into the system in a supportive way? Because nobody, of course, would want to be overly optimistic. We want a truthful exchange, really. So how are we sort of encouraging that behaviour? And then the second point, I sort of go back to when the financial plans were outlined. It's that point about recurrent savings. And I know you gave me assurance because I said I was worried that the savings would have an impact on patient outcomes and experience, particularly for those who were most disadvantaged. And I know that there's checks and balances in place at trust level and at system level, but is there a way in future reports that we could get more of a sense of what this looks like from a patient and community perspective around the changes that are happening? Because at the moment it's obviously a very financially focused report, but I just feel really uncomfortable. I'm looking at spreadsheets thinking, okay, well that's X amount coming out the system. What does that mean from a patient and public perspective? And is there a risk that it's less palatable because it is non-recurrent savings and perhaps easier stuff is being taken out? That's the worry that I've got, and I don't have any assurance at the moment around that.
Yeah. So I think one of the obviously the quality impact assessments and the quality impact assessments processes in place now. We've got that, and I can bring more of that into the report. One of the issues that one of the, I suppose, the reasons why that isn't featuring heavily in here is most of it's been technical and non-recurrent and slippy as opposed to anything, and that's why we're not seeing a lot of that. But I can bring that in, and I'm happy to talk to you outside of this meeting, Debbie, about the way in which you might want to see that. So we can definitely bring more of it. I think it's an important point. Yeah. So I think your other point, the first point, was around the
level of risk. So how are we sort of encouraging behaviours in a truthful, supportive exchange with providers, that when those reforecasts come through, that they are accurate and people aren't just avoiding what could be seen as a long list of sanctions if they do tell the truth? Yeah. So we are working together, and I think we're doing a lot of work as a group together within the finance function, but also looking at some of those that approach through the month 6. You're absolutely right. This paper is describing a declaration at the board, a recovery plan should people but actually we're taking that action now. We're asking for that now in November, irrespective of whether people really are changing their forecast, because it would be good practice to go through that. But we're doing it through this peer-to-peer review. So part of that is about learning from each other and what would be helpful. So the actual community that are working together on this are actually working in partnership with each other and sharing some good practice. So there will be mitigations formed by that, but I think there's always more we can do. But that is definitely part of what we're doing. This isn't about us sitting there and slapping everybody and say, there definitely isn't, because that won't work. It's got to be us working together, but at the same time we need rigour and we need the controls and we need delivery. So we're getting that balance, and I think that's been probably, if I'm honest, I think getting to this point has been probably one of the biggest challenges in trying to find that balance. What's the sweet spot of that? Because you need both.
Sheena?
Yeah. First of all, I just wanted to thank Sam for a very clear introduction to the paper. I think that was very useful and very well articulated around the need to ensure that we aren't wasting anything and we're getting the right care for people. So thanks for that, Sam. What I wanted to do was to kind of pick up the bit around the theme that runs through Kevin's report, your report, Sam, about the getting well, the bit about the sort of the stabilisation piece through to restoring and then the transformation. And I think one of the things that we need to be mindful as we move through that is to just take that view a little bit about what Angie was saying about let's take the system-wide view on this. So it's really important that when we're doing our work as an ICB, we take our kind of first stage stuff, which is what are we responsible for, then what's our oversight system, and then it's the system working together. And I think, you know, there's huge opportunities for us to start to really think about when the threads come into the work that James is going to talk about in a minute about transformation, about how can we see that value to our population in the better use of resources, that it, you know, improves the outcomes for our population. And I think it's really important that as we move through what we're doing as an ICB that we do all of those things, but recognising the immediate focus is on the stabilisation bit, which is what you've described and what we're really talking about in terms of how do we really get a really good feel for that and understanding of that, which will enable us to lead through to the other two parts. So I think really helpful to bring all those things together, and I think the way that that was constructed both in Kevin's paper is really helpful, but also in the other papers that's here this morning. So really just thanks to the executive team for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. I've got Sarah, then Ibby.
Yeah, I was just wanting to respond on Angie's offer really, and that would be welcome. So I think a particular area that's really a real challenge for us, again, from the ICB perspective at the moment, is CHC packages of care, which are rising in cost and number at an exponential level at the minute. And because the infrastructure, as I've reported here before at board, from our perspective at the moment, isn't what it needs to be, it's very difficult for us to contain that. Now, I am going to bring something back to board in December, and I think there is a real opportunity around CHC to get that right. I think since we did the repatriation settlement, our teams are working much better on this, but there is definitely more opportunity for that joint commissioning of those packages, and you do it better generally in social care than we do it in health. So we will take up that offer, and maybe you and I can pick that up outside. In terms of the Carnal Farrow work, I am aware of that work, and it's really important when James reports on the transformation programmes going forward that that work gets taken into that work. And I know Louise was very close to that work, so we are already aware of that and need to make sure that the transformation work, particularly around community and primary care, embraces that Carnal Farrow work. So we are aware of that.
Thank you, Ibby.
Yeah, thank you. Just going back to these figures, Sam, I remember when we agreed this, particularly around provider SIPs, there was an element of RAG rating those SIPs, and there was an element of risk identified that was at the higher end. I just want to understand how much of that higher end risk is now materialising in terms of the variance, and have we gone beyond that high risk kind of a category, or is this within that high risk tolerance that we thought would always be there?
Yeah, so what we've got, and again, as part of month 6, this has been updated, but what we've got from every organisation is the RAG rating of all the SIPs and all of the, from each of the organisations. We've been doing some work to consolidate that. I'm quite happy to bring this into the paper so you can get more of a sense of that. I would say I haven't got exact figures on the whole picture, but I would say it's at least half of it is very high risk at the moment, and we are looking at non-recurrent actions that have been replacing recurrent SIP, which is the bigger issue for me as well. So there is a high level of risk still in the system, but I can bring that picture back and show it you on a more global basis of a consolidated position, if that would be helpful.
And Jeff.
Thank you, Chair. I think I've said this before, but I think it's really relevant now to this discussion about. And Jim said, so what are we going to do? You know, when's the action going to start happening? And one of the things that's always perturbed me is about how much clinical buy-in there is to change. And looking at the, I'm just looking in the next paper, the delivery programmes, and there's lots of clinical stuff in there. And so my question is, how activated are the clinicians in the trust, David or Kevin might say, about actually saying, yeah, we're going to work with this because we recognise it's important, as opposed to what I often see, which is, yeah, agree with the strategy, agree we've got to save money, not in my backyard. So how activated are the clinicians to get involved in this and help us come in on budget? What do we need to do?
On that point, I'll come back to you, Jane. I'll come to Chris and Kevin, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I think at last board I talked about the recovery programme that we've got in place and just started really in the starting blocks at LSCFT. Yesterday we held our senior leaders team, Jeff. Yeah. 3/4 of the people around there were our clinical leaders. The event was chaired by myself and David Fernley as our Chief Medical Officer. It is crucial that we get that leadership from our clinicians, and the engagement that we had through with our cross-cutting EIP themes for both this year, but for making sure we're planning already for 23-24, but also that grip and control that's needed. And it might be uncomfortable, but it's making sure that we do that together and we take people with us on that change journey. Absolutely.
And Kevin?
I think the honest answer to that, Jeff, is it's mixed.
Yeah.
And we've got to make sure that we get that full clinical buy-in, whatever we do, because we all know if we don't, it won't happen.
Yeah.
So I think what we need to go back to are what are the drivers for the costs and the additional costs in the system. So from an acute perspective, we've got too many beds open across our system, funded and paid for and staffed by temporary staff. So we need to look at those drivers, and we need to get behind those drivers. Now, there's various reasons for it. There's too much detail that we can go into today. But that's in essence what we need to do. We've got too many wards open across the system with patients in there who should be elsewhere in the system. So this is about a whole system response. If we just do what we've always done and just focus on the acutes, we will not get the savings, and we will not drive out the savings that are required. This is a whole system response that's required, and it's going to take some significant challenge and reorganisation of where and how services are delivered and provided. And we've got to get into that space, and we've never got into that space as a system. If we just do what we've always done, which is focus on marginal savings within the acute sector, we'll get what we've always got, which is what we've got now.
Thank you. Tracy?
Thank you. Yeah, it really does pick up on what Kevin has just said, really, and a few of the other points, and Angie's point about us being integrated and bringing in all of the partners that are part of this. To me, what we do, and this is no way a criticism, Sam, because these problems seem insurmountable when we're trying to find cost savings in a system where we've got more demand now and we know more demand is coming down the line. But I think we run the risk of looking at the problem head on, and often when we think about it in the round, we can think about all the other areas where we could make savings. So I just don't think we've got enough intelligence at the moment around what works. And just to give you one example, I could pick from loads of examples, but there's many initiatives that are happening in communities that are trying to divert people away from going to A&E when it's not appropriate for them to go into A&E, often within mental health, but many other initiatives. And I just don't feel we've got a handle on what's working. And I think there are things that are working, and I think that's where some of the solutions to the problems lie. So I suppose, like Angie, it's a bit of an offer really to say I want to try and help in some way for us to be able to get more intelligence around those initiatives, because I think there is so much happening that isn't funded by this system but could be brought in as part of the solution.
It's very good, thank you. Tracy? And Jane?
It's a sort of follow-up question around this theme of sort of clinical engagement, management engagement, and how decisions get made, and it's more of a process question. And it's based on curiosity, because I haven't worked in it, so I don't know. But whether we're talking about embedding best practice or making changes, is that viewed as kind of holistically in terms of how that would benefit patients, improve things for staff? You know, what will it cost? What will be the savings? Or is it more that things are done in silos? So there's a bit of clinical thinking, and somewhere along the line the kind of management accountants get involved and have a look at how much it'll cost. And because it seems to me that there may be a bit of a disconnect. And going forward, because we're talking about change and innovation, unless we look at this in the round, we're going to end up with the same kind of problems that we've, you know, and we've talked about this challenge, haven't we, from a patient experience perspective. I just don't know how decisions get made, and I wonder whether there's some sort of kind of process answer to this.
Sam then David.
So part of the answer, and I really welcome both Angie and Tracy's input into this as well, but I think part of the way that we're going to be doing that is through we're starting to look at how we've planned to, and not making excuses that we're not very old, but we aren't very old, and we haven't embedded all of the processes and procedures that we need, but we're getting there quite quickly. And part of the work that Maggie and I have been talking about is actually into this next planning round, and we're starting that now. We've already got meetings starting to set up with Tracy and others to start looking at how do we fully integrate and how do we look at this more holistically, because finance should not be driving any of this.
Yes.
Finance is an absolute enabler to what we need to do, and I'm trying to position my team and the people around me to support these programs of work and the planning process. But the planning process is going to be really important this year, because it's our opportunity to really feed some of this transformation in and start thinking about that more holistic approach that you're talking about, I think. But the answer will be, without doubt, some of the answer to this is going to lie in how we work with the partners and how we learn from. I've got a background of working for 5 years as a director of finance in the third sector, and I was a trustee for 7 years. And I've seen the power of what can be done through voluntary sector and other sectors in some of the answers to the transformation we're going to need. But this is a bit about why I'm frustrated. We're not faster or further on than we are, but we can only be where we're going to be. But we definitely have got that planned in.
And David, then I'll come back to Kevin for the last bit.
Thank you. And typically what would happen, particularly within providers, but we increasingly do this across pathways now with primary care and secondary care working together, is looking at, what can we do with the pathway of care for a particular condition? But you're doing it often in a multidisciplinary way. And you'll have nurses and AHP saying, well, I could do that. We don't need a doctor to do that. The doctors are usually quite reluctant to give anything up, by the way. But the fact is we can use skill mix. We've got benchmarking data. We've got benchmarking data, particularly comparing different organisations through the GIRF programme and other programmes. You can say, well, how do we make this better? Other people can do it better. How can we do it better? And so it's using the data, it's using that multidisciplinary working, and its engagement with primary and secondary care, and of course, increasingly and very importantly, with the voluntary sector, who we haven't really utilised so very well, to say, look, let's do this as a system and do it differently. But the emphasis is always on what's best for the patient.
Look, I think you share our pain. It's a challenging year. It was always going to be a challenging year. We were born in July. The budget nationally wasn't adopted until sometime in August. We are playing catch-up. I think you've seen in a succession of reports and briefings the numbers going the wrong way. Low levels of recurrent savings, which means we've got a bit of a mountain to climb next year. By nature, I'm a natural optimist. I have to be supporting the football team I support. And I strongly support we've got to take up the offers, and we're already starting some stuff with local government and the voluntary sector. It's critical, but it is very late to have an impact this year. I think we've got to be really clear about that. That shouldn't stop us doing it, because it'll make a much bigger contribution next year, which is really important that we go for. On the risks of SOF4, there are some risks there. I think they're relatively small, and there are other risks I think we need to be more worried about than SOF4. I think first of all, lots of other systems are in the same position as us. There are some differences, though. We've called it out. And at your very first business meeting, we took action there. Very few systems have done that. So I think we've been more upfront and more aggressive around doing something about it, which should help us an awful lot. I guess what I'm more worried about is not SOF4, but more intrusive monitoring and checking and having somebody with a clipboard looking over our shoulder, making copious notes and introducing more controls that actually diverts us from this task. And I think that's a real risk. If we get into the territory of forecasting a deficit, you're running that risk at a very significant level. So that's something we need to bear in mind. But coming back to the optimism, there are some green shoots which will come through in the December report. Just to give you a few, University Hospitals Morgan Bay making actually really steady progress in terms of recurrent savings. That needs to be celebrated. LSC, FT and the ICB itself, I think we'll see a step change in risk reduction in the December report. That makes a material difference to our year-end position. And we're starting to see some of those transformation projects, which we're going to cover shortly. We'll have some decisions that will give us a little bit more confidence, but time is getting short. I think the final thing I'd end on is it's really, really important that we put next year's budget to bed early, before the year end. You know, it seems pretty obvious and basic, but actually agreeing the budget before the 1st of April, which is not the norm in the NHS, but we've got to do it and give ourselves 12 months to, particularly with the mountain we're going to have to climb. I'm confident from an ICB position that we, as our organisation, our budget, will be in a very strong position for next year in terms of recurring savings. But, you know, it's going to be challenged across the bigger system, and their numbers, the numbers in the trusts are far bigger than ours are. So getting that budget agreed early, February, March next year, critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, everybody, for contributing to the discussion. Look, in different times, the finance was a pass or fail. You either met the statutory duty or you didn't. It was very binary in that sense. We're not, as a board, we're grounded in the reality of where we're at now. And as Angie and others have said, none of us can look honestly at the numbers in front of us and expect that we will pass in terms of the statutory duty at the end of the year. It's a hard thing to say, but that's where we're at. It's not a simple pass-fail measure anymore. It's too difficult for that. So what we have to do in here is therefore I think is apply two tests. One, are we improving or not? And going back to the discussion we had previously about productivity and different ways of working with Angie's people and Tracy's people and so on and so forth. So are we getting better? And are we active in a process of getting better? And Sheena and Kevin have talked about the system perspective we can take, and we've had real examples again from Angie and Tracy about all of that. So are we taking that whole system view and identifying opportunities that we can be more efficient and productive tomorrow than we are today? That's one test we need to apply. And the harder test, though, to apply is, are we doing the best that we can do in the circumstances? And I think we need to do a bit, and so our job is, as a number of colleagues on said, is in challenging this. Okay, we can't make it all fit into the available budget this year, but are we doing the very best that we can do in the circumstances with the resource that we've got? Maybe we think about that frame as to how we can begin to track our progress on that for future. Because I think that's what, a very high level summary, that's what colleagues around the table are challenging us to do, to say, can we do that? But a good report, and I endorse the comments Jim and others made about we've got now to, I think, to a good understanding of, a realistic understanding of where we're at. In your presentation, it was very good on all of that, Sam, thank you. James, Delivery Board Transformation Programmes.
Thank you, Chair. So this follows on quite nicely from the discussion that we just had and Sam's paper. So my report comes from a request from the last board meeting to provide an update on the delivery programmes, also referred to in previous papers as the big five programmes. There's actually more than five, as you'll see in the table. we've divided the last programme into a number of different elements. So what I want to do in this is to provide an update on those programmes, but also take the opportunity to also reference and call out the transformation programmes that we're taking forward. But then I want to finish to really highlight the action that we are taking and that we need to take to accelerate the conversion, and I think that's a really important point here, the conversion of this work into clear, robust trajectories and benefits that we can track and we can plan and certainly we can pull into the position for next year, because that's what we're not doing particularly well, and that's what we're not strong enough and we're not quick enough in being able to do that. So I'll come on to that, which is a really important point towards the end. So just to remind people, we've got on the 27th of July, the first business meeting of this board, we presented 5 major programmes of work. Now, these were the stabilisation programmes, so the programmes that were due to deliver over a 12 to 18 month delivery period, 12 to 18 month trajectory. These are set out within the table. These were based very much upon some very hard evidence and a good piece of work that was undertaken in 2021, which involved a lot of benchmarking, analysis, measurement, etc. And that identified 3 main areas of opportunity for the system. So establishing a sustainable workforce model, and we've talked quite a bit already today about workforce. We understand that the cost of our temporary workforce has risen and has risen consistently over recent months. Clinical excellence, so really streamlining our services, improving the quality, and driving standardisation and levelling up, critical. And then corporate services opportunities. So 3 major areas of opportunity. Those have driven the 5 stability programme areas. We've also got a recovery and a transformation phase that we've outlined for the systems improvement and transformation journey. And those are the that scale of improvement, which is kind of 2+ years onward. The medium term improvement is going to be driven by the transformation programmes, and there are 3 major transformation programmes. Of course, a number of different components to each of those, but I've set them out in the paper at 1.4.3. So those are transforming primary community services. So in that, we've got real focus on improving our approach to prevention, the work around integrated neighbourhood teams, intermediate care, and work that we're talking about increasingly now in terms of a much more innovative approach to domiciliary care through a true partnership in collaboration with the local authorities. So that's the transformation of primary community care services programme. We're looking to get that launched imminently within the coming weeks. We're in the process of pulling together the team for that, the scope, the outline, the programme plans, and the resources, and that's a very much collaborative programme of work. We've then got a piece of work to transform the workforce model for the future. So that's taking a strategic approach around the workforce that we need to take the future service models forward. So that will be very different. That's not cutting around the edges. That's not looking at bank and agency. That's truly looking at what the multidisciplinary workforce needs to look like sustainably for the system for the future. And then finally, the third of the major transformation programmes is looking at transforming our hospital estate. And of course, a lot of that work's already well underway in terms of the new hospitals programme. So that's where we sit in terms of these programmes. And Angie, to your point, absolutely, the Cardinal Farrow work is fundamentally part of that transforming community services work. And we're due to provide updates to the board early next year, which we'll be doing on each of these programmes. In fact, in February, we're coming forward with a first update on the shared corporate platform work. So if I now turn to the 5 big programmes, these are the ones that we hope and intend will deliver sizable benefits over the 12 to 18 month period. And the first thing I want to say is that we know these are the right programmes. These programmes are based on data, engagement, input. We know these are the right programmes, and they're mapped out there. 4 of these would describe as in the mobilisation phase, and 3 of them are in delivery phase. So now these are the right programmes of work. We've got lots of good work going on. There's good engagement and input from each of our provider organisations, and I know we can do better in terms of wider input. We need to pick that up. But there is good active engagement into these. We've already talked a little bit earlier about, for example, P2, elective recovery programme, and P3, which is the streaming clinical networks. Lots of engagement on those, and indeed in terms of the bank and agency work, we've had some delays there, but we are now due this week to go out to tender for the collaborative bank, and within the next 2 weeks we're due to kick off a major quick win workforce optimisation piece of work, which will pick up a lot of the improvement methodology work that's recently been undertaken. We've just this week we've just had the programme manager for the corporate collaborative work join us, so that in earnest will now move forward. So there's lots of energy and engagement, but we've not moved quick enough on some of these. We have had some real delays in getting some of the project teams up to date, getting them online and getting SROs in place. And what that's meant is that we don't yet have clear enough and firm enough trajectories. And you can see that in the table. The delivery trajectories remain in the main as indicative rather than firm. So that's our priority. That's something that we absolutely must and will focus on. So let me just talk a little bit about what we're going to do on those things. So we're putting much greater focus through the delivery board now on the trajectories and on that conversion point that I talked about, which is essential. So we've had the phase of setup for a lot of these programs. Some are still in setup mode, but for many of them they're in setup. So we are now focusing the delivery board in terms of confirming trajectories, milestones, and on to delivery. We're going to be doing increasingly deep dives for this board into these programs going forward. So you'll get the opportunity to see and test and take the pulse on some of these programs. And then finally, and really importantly, we're about to do a piece of work to set up rapidly a system program management office. We don't have this in place yet, so we don't have currently the level of program rigor and grip that we really need around each of these. So the stuff that a lot of you will be very, very familiar with is key to success, particularly in large-scale cross-cutting programs. So consistent program plans, clear milestones, risk stratification against each one of them, and very, very robust trajectories that we're able to report against consistently on a monthly basis. We're moving to get that in place. Kevin McGee, myself, and a number of others from across the provider collaborative and the ICB have been working on that over the past couple of weeks. So we're due to have that work taken forward during November, December, and January. We are aiming to have a PMO, a fully functioning PMO in place by February, which will be a major step forward in terms of the point of conversion, which is where all of our focus needs to be. We've done the work on opportunities. We've done a lot of the work on setup. We have got good engagement. It could always be better. It's now about conversion, and we are laser focused on that. I'm happy to take any comments.
Well done, James. Debbie, Jim, Sheena.
Thanks, David. Benefit of having the quickest hand. I feel like I'm getting... I'll slow down with future ones. I think it's a fantastic paper. I really welcome it, and I welcome the oversight that you're giving to us and the assurance of a really rigorous but also strategic approach to deliver and loop back against priorities and commitments that we've made as a board. I'd sort of like us to challenge ourselves and maybe make a commitment in the meeting around how patient, public, carer involvement and engagement will be embedded through this activity. One of the conversations we had that was really important at the first Patient Involvement and Engagement Advisory Committee meeting was about how we've got 10 national priorities that says this is what great involvement and engagement looks like, and this is what we want ICBs to do to deliver against it. But how do we make those principles live so that everybody in the ICB and the ICS is aware of them, knows what great practice is, and can deliver and can work with people to make sure that everything we do gets the best outcomes. And I think that there's a real opportunity right at the start of these delivery programmes and system transformation programmes to not only do a quality impact assessment and an equalities impact assessment, to actually develop a public involvement and engagement assessment that's maybe unique to us, but formally maps back against those national priorities and our commitment to involve people in these decisions, and says what do we do, how do we consider it, how do we demonstrate best practice. And there's a couple that are particularly key. So on those delivery programmes, streamlining clinical care networks, we need to involve people in how we decide that's done and what that looks like to get the best possible outcomes. And also transforming primary and community services, that needs to be done with people, contributing to what that looks like and how it needs to work. But I think if you could actually make a formal commitment that we'll almost have 3 assessments that are done, that then means that we embed and we bake in that check, toolkit and best practice right at the start, rather than it coming through to board and it's been missed and we're trying to play catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking and nodding at Sarah as we do this, because Sarah's team have got a critical role in terms of the QIAs, but I think that's absolutely spot on. I mean, to be honest, as part of a decent QIA, we should be picking up anyway, rather than even needing it to be a separate piece of work. A robust QIA would pick that up anyway, but you're absolutely spot on. I know you want to.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, those things will be built in right from the beginning in the programme management approach, and we have got the QIAs and the EIA tools ready now and working, so yeah, absolutely from the beginning. All of that will be built in.
Thank you. Jim?
Thanks, and thanks, James, for the report. Again, it felt more realistic than what we've been saying previously about where we're at on things, and that's helpful to know. Very pleased to see about the PMO office, Programme Management Office. I think that's really important. We need to not undersize it, though. I mean, one of the problems a lot of organisations have is that they undersize that, and it becomes almost a bureaucratic process rather than something which drives the schemes forward. But I'm sure you've got that in hand. I suppose the point I was going to make is, you rightly said you'll be coming back in later in the year telling us how things are going. It would be helpful to somehow see this in almost like in a Gantt chart form, because there's so many layers to this, it feels. And it's hard to be hard for us to track. If it's possible to do it in a sort of simplified, it's almost contradiction in terms, it's like an oxymoron, a simplified Gantt chart, but something which actually will allow us to kind of track how we're getting on and be aware of key dates and milestones and the like. Would be really important, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely.
Thanks, Jim. Agree with that.
Can I just pick up on the point of the PMO? Yeah. Just give you some assurance about it. So what we're going to do, given the fact that this needs to be a full system-wide PMO, so this will be picking up programmes not just from an ISB perspective, but from a provider collaborative, reducing duplication, and meaning that we're really focusing upon the core programmes. We know, for example, that there are numerous programmes within the provider club. There are numerous programmes within the ICB, many of which are legacy CCG programmes. So we're going to be engaging a partner to help us over a rapid period of time during this 3-month period to do a full scan of all of the programmes that exist, along with all of the project management resource that exists across the system, so that we can. So we're taking a really robust approach. This isn't going to be just a home-built thing. We're going to engage some external support to help us design this and set this up properly from scratch.
I must confess, I would prefer it to be a homemade one than external support. Whenever I've seen external support, it gets so confusing, but you know, I'll prove the pudding and all that.
Okay, thank you.
Sheena, please.
I really just want to thank James for his very clear paper. I think it's very well set out, and I think the whole kind of framework, I think, makes an awful lot of sense. The bit, and I just really wanted to kind of just sort of pick out was, and Kevin, you mentioned in your introductory opening paper and remarks, is about the development of place-based, and I'm delighted we've now got Craig in post I kind of hear you a bit about we've only got 2 of the 4 place-based directors, but this is really going to have significant traction, particularly in thinking about how do we engage the third sector, how do we engage our populations, how do we really do things very differently when we've got our places really, really effective. So we've got obviously our system view, really pleased that we have a system PMO, but I think it's really just sort of making sure that we pick up that bit around place and make sure that we really focus on getting those really effective as quickly as we can, because that's going to make a big difference and enable us to involve people in the way that Debbie beautifully described.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks,
Thank
Sheena.
you. David, do you want to come?
No, it's fine, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. I've got Kevin and then Roy, and then I'll come back to you, Kevin, to move us on.
Just very briefly, David, really support this as a proposal. I think if we can get this right, it gives us a model of how we do things once across the system. Then what we've got in not just this area, in many different areas, we've got duplication of people, we've got duplication of work, and we haven't got the capacity to do that. We haven't got the funding to do that. So I think it's really important we all get behind this, we make it work, and use it as a model about how we do things once across Lancashire, South Cumbria. So very supportive, James. It's a good paper. I think to Jim's point about it being internal, I think it's going to be staffed by internal people. So I think, you know, it will have a very strong internal element. The external bit is just how do we set it up, but actually driven by our own people, owned by us and driven by us, but great piece of work.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And Roy.
Thanks, David. Yes, just echo what everyone said on a great piece of work there. Thanks for that, James. Just really following on from what Sheena said about place-based partnerships and the opportunity, I think, for them to be involved in this transformation. Particularly, I think something that's at my own heart really is the transforming primary and community services. And I think realistically, you know, we have to use those place-based partnerships to be involved on population health, as we know we've already done some of that. And I also welcome as well in the paper, I'll be brief on this, but we're looking at a deep dive into some of these that come back to the board, you know, and so I think that's really helpful. James, you know, the whole paper's really welcomed, and as Jim said, the PMO as well. But I think we've got to own that PMO, you know, really have got to own it ourselves and run with it. So thanks very much.
Kevin?
Yeah, good discussion, good report. On the deep dives, I mean, we'll come back when we're ready in the new year on to show real progress and look at some of the issues. So it'll be things like the discharge and flow project, it'll be banking agency, it'll be common platform, and some ideas which we're going to develop with our local government colleagues around what we do in that interface area, because that needs to feature in our long-term plan. Really one observation, I think we just need to get the style of this right. Often in the public sector, you know, you have comprehensive plans, you consult everywhere, you go through a whole load of things, surprise, surprise, you get nothing done, and it takes forever, and you lose focus. So I think we've absolutely take on board the point about having quality, patients, carers sort of at the centre, but we need to be nimble and agile, and there's a way to do this. I think we have to keep things really simple, pick a few things, deliberately choose easy wins. So if you look at clinical integration, pick some of the easier pathways, not some of the more challenging ones to get things done, to, you know, low-hanging fruits, the sort of jargon around it. But you get where I'm coming. Build confidence, get some quick wins, and do it in that way. So I think that agility, being nimble, is absolutely critical to this. Otherwise, you know, I remember in local, they had something called best value, gathered data for Africa, nothing happened. So we've got to have it's a sort of deductive rather than inductive approach. Deductive approach, use our understanding of what the key issues are, use the understanding of the staff in the key areas to figure out what the 3 or 4 obvious things are to do early and go for them, rather than collect data forever, takes a year, and then you get lost in it and nothing happens. So I think there's a really, really important thing here about style, that we need to get right, and be confident in that. So don't, keep the processes very purposeful, rather than tying us down and stopping us doing things and delaying decisions.
Thank you, Kevin. Well done, James. I noted that the projected savings from your 5 schemes all added up roughly to the number that Sam said was where we're heading to on the phone. Is that an accidental coincidence, or just great teamwork behind the scenes? You don't need to answer that. Okay, let's move on. Maggie's report, please.
Thank you, David. And there's so much that's already been said during the course of this meeting, which just very applicable to this report. I particularly want to just start with some of the sentiments from Sam around what our role is and how we work with all of those who are providing services across Lancs and South Cumbria. And I think it's really important. So my reflections today are: the performance report speaks volumes, and we can still see all of the areas where we need to continue to improve. All of us around this table are echoing the sentiments of improving at pace, but we all recognise the infancy of this board and the relationships that we're developing with those that we're working alongside. I know personally, in the limited time I've been with us, with the organisation, doesn't feel passive from where I'm sat. The conversations and the ambition of those who I'm meeting is really testament to the boards of those organisations and the ambitions that they've got. I haven't come to this system and found that it's wanting for ideas and ambition and good governance. It's not at all. It's how do we work alongside each other to provide the right level of support and challenge, peer-to-peer review, to see our pace moving in a quicker way. I also want to just thank everybody that who might watch this broadcast at a later date from across health and social care across Lancs and South Cumbria. As part of my induction, I've been really pleased to talk to people who do take the time to listen to what we've got to say. When you talk about performance and you show the red scorecard, people on the front line can take that as a criticism of how they're working individually. And I don't think any of us are suggesting any criticism for our frontline staff. We all recognise, and I think Kevin said it earlier, the challenging environments that people are working within. And so anything that I say or write in this report is not criticism, but it is to help us push ourselves forward. I'd also like to say that reporting on performance is not my lifelong goal or ambition. I find myself doing it, and I really hope that we move into a different place quite soon. What I want to be able to report to you is the progress on continuous improvement across all of the domains that fall within our remit. We have done a number of things in month that are progressing the scorecard, and I won't go into them unless people have got questions. We will be able to discuss that more in the January workshop. I want to just pick up on a couple of points. What I have been exposed to in the last 5 weeks is that all of our trusts have got recovery plans which are owned and cited on by their relevant boards. And again, I've spoken to a number of board members who can tell me about the challenge that individual boards are bringing to chief execs and chief operating officers, other directors in relation to PACE. So I know that the recovery plans are owned. When it comes up into a more helicopter position, we can, if we're not careful, make this an even more confused position. If we had a Venn diagram, we'd be able to see quite clearly. We've got a regional performance element, we've got PCB performance element, and now ourselves. And this is not what we're trying to do. We are not trying to duplicate and add to the burden of performance management. We do have to remind ourselves all the time, our questions aren't about why not are others not doing. Our question is, what are we doing to add value to what others are doing? I know we talked about ambulance earlier and some really hard-hitting examples, I think, Roy, from what we know our community's experiencing. Again, we have to be really careful that we're looking at the root cause and not just one of the symptoms. Kevin has mentioned on a number of times some of the congestion that our acutes find themselves in. And I do believe we have to be innovative in the way that colleagues have said around the table this morning. I'm not going to go into the detail. I know you've all read the paper. Colleagues will talk to the relevant parts if there are questions. And then I do think, David, if we can move into winter as well, I'll keep that separate. I know Kevin's paper mentions it, but it warrants us having a few minutes on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's all very clear. It's Kevin.
Just to say to Maggie, delighted that Maggie's here, delighted to be working alongside her. Also think the way you presented the report was very fair, proportionate and balanced. We need to get challenge into the system, and we need to recognise where things are going well and where things are not going well. And I think absolutely your report does it, and the way you presented it does it. So delighted you're here and delighted to be working alongside you.
Yeah, Maggie, thanks again for this. I think it's come along really well since the last meeting, and seeing the balanced scorecard at the back is really helpful. I think clearly there's opportunities for us to reflect on this in terms of what might be missing, and you said we're going to do that in January, so I won't say any more on that, but look forward to that conversation in terms of just making sure we do capture a number of areas that perhaps aren't there at the moment, so thank you for that.
Jeff?
Thanks, Chair. Maggie, the ward question. Is there variation between wards in the way they handle patients who are fit for discharge or not?
So I'm scared to look at Sarah because I know she desperately will want to come in on this as well. So the simple answer, of course, there is. And there'll be variation every hour of every day and every ward across the breadth of our system and patch. I don't believe we will ever completely eradicate that. But all of our boards across this system are all cited on ward dashboards, where each of the organisations will be looking really forensically at what happens shift by shift in their own organisations. But I think they would all admit that there is huge variation, and predominantly my experience here and in other systems, it's all about leadership. But Sarah, I'm sure you'll want to comment.
I will comment. I haven't got the details, obviously, for you, Jeff, but I mean, it's just, I suppose it's no different than primary care, is it? We absolutely know there's variation in referral patterns in. So very similarly, the clinicians on different wards will have variations in the level of risk, how they understand what's available in the community or in primary care to discharge people. So there will be variation. But again, you know, as Maggie said, daily in the acute trust, there are teams going round working often in an integrated way at who can they get out and how can they get out. So even though there's variation, I'm sure there'll be senior oversight on every ward and to try and address that variation.
Yeah, it's about whether we can learn from that and whether there's any peer-to-peer review. So, you know, one clinician might keep a patient longer than needed. I've seen it in other systems where I know in the private system, Bupa watch it like a hawk. And I know in America I've seen where the clinicians in charge are challenged by what's called a hospitalist who actually controls the budget and says, right, you've finished treating that patient, why do you want to keep them in longer? That kind of conversation, without it being too challenging, is helpful.
And I think, Kevin, I'm sure that does go on a lot in trust. In fact, they've been doing peer-to-peer reviews of outcome measures for consultants for a long, long time. And actually, it's something that primary care and wider community services could learn from more peer-to-peer review and challenge. So it does go on. And, you know, Kevin may want to reinforce that. But I know that has been embedded in acute trust for... In fact, I can remember when it came out, when they started to look at different outcome data for consultants across and had to start publishing that. So that work does go on.
Angie, then back to Maggie, please.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the report, which is it's got a lot of information in it. It's very helpful, and it's coming forward in a really positive way, and we'll continue to develop that. Just I was really trying to make the link between our conversation earlier about the basics and getting those rights and the link to innovation. And I was just reflecting on the balanced scorecard, which probably doesn't give me or any of the board members any insight into those basics. Now, I think we need to recognise a balanced scorecard is what it is, and it can't cover every entity, or else we'd never read it and we'd never get anything to take from it. And it's also a relatively static document, so, you know, getting those trends, getting that granular detail or sight of that when it's important that we get sight of that as a board is always going to be the challenge for us. And I just wondered if there's something about us thinking about whether on a rolling basis, as part of the performance report, we seek a commentary from, say, one of the providers or the ICB or whatever it happens to be, so that we hear from them in their language, their insights which will go beyond the balanced scorecard and perhaps pick up those things which we don't have a metric for but are areas of concern for them, and equally get their assurances around things like the basics so that we're cited on that. So I just wonder if there's something to think about how we bring that more anecdotal information and that actual insight, not about our interpretation of the data, but from those people who are responsible for the services that deliver that data, for us to hear as a board. So just something to consider. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I think that's really helpful, and myself and Kevin are actually meeting tomorrow afternoon. I think I'll add that to the list because I think it's really important. I do think the basics are important. Obviously they are. We have to get into a position for this board, though, to be able to be in the area that we really need it. You know, many people who do the basics don't need our commentary on that, because as long as we know it's being delivered in a way that meets the right requisite standards, then that's fine, because there's other areas where we really do need to focus, and we've talked about some of that transformational change. So yeah, I think me and Kevin can try and look at how this report in the future, we've got the seminar in January, but how do we bring some of that soft intelligence in a way that doesn't ambush the meeting but gives you a sense of feeling?
Thanks, David. And of course, discharges and flow is the fundamental issue and the problems that we've got at the moment within the acute sector. So I can actually absolutely assure Jeff and colleagues what we call the simple discharges, the discharges that were in the gift of clinicians within the acute sector. Every patient is reviewed every day, and we really have a very, very tight grip on that, and we know the wards where it needs to improve and the wards where it doesn't. But discharge is a very complicated issue, and the majority of the pressures that we face are because of what we call the complex discharges, where patients are waiting for packages in social care or domiciliary care, they need community care, they need therapy care, and it's not just within the gift of the acute clinicians to discharge those patients, because if we did, they would be being discharged to unsafe conditions. So this is a real whole systems issue. We need the support from local government colleagues. There are issues in terms of social care because of the workforce in social care. There's issues in terms of community services and the ability of community services to support those discharges where they happen. So this is a really complicated area, and it needs a whole systems review. If we just focus on the narrow aspects of the acute trust, we will not get the discharges and the flow that's necessary within the acute trust. This is a whole systems issue, and everybody has to contribute towards it.
So, Kevin, James, then back to me.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just giving some thought to Angie's point, which I thought was really well made, in terms of how some of the trends, how the board gets assurance, direct assurance against action against some of the trends. And I'm just giving some thought, Ibby, to the way that we've agreed to do this through the people board for the people metrics, which I think is going to work really well. We just agreed this at the last meeting. So we have a very detailed workforce report now across all of the workforce metrics, which pulls out all the outliers and all the trend variations. And what we've agreed is that the provider representative on there, which is Trish. She's the PCB Chief Exec Lead. Will take those variations away, have a conversation within the provider collab, and she will come back to the next meeting and feedback a direct response from the provider collaborative on the variation and what each of the providers are doing. So there's a very authentic response, and the people board can then hear that response and either challenge, support, etc. I mean, we think that will work really well, and that the people board reports directly into here. So maybe that can help by way of giving some authentic feedback and assurance upwards. I don't know whether that approach would work more broadly with other committees, but the committee's probably got a key role in helping to get to that point.
Yeah, agree. And back to you, Maggie.
Thank you. I do think some of the discussion that we've had, and I was hoping it would have been pulled out really with some maybe comments or questions around the not meeting criteria to reside point. And I think, Kevin, you refer to it frequently, but I'm not sure that we really do it with justice in the performance report in the way that it's written. I would, Kevin, if I may, suggest that might be a subject for a deep dive, because it is causing us significant issues. And we talk about basics. There is nothing more basic than the proposition of being discharged in a timely way from a hospital spell. So it is one of the basic things that we consistently are challenged with. And I think that would be a great example of a basic being escalated here for us really to understand if there is anything that we can do with more innovation and more pace. But I would very much welcome the opportunity to do that. Thanks, David.
Okay, so we're making progress with this. I think in our meetings here, and James makes an important point about getting the right structure between the more detailed work that's been done in the committees and how that feeds into the board and the back and two between them. But I think there's two things that, by the nature of our organisation in this meeting, we need to focus on. One of those is, where there's trajectories for improvement, are we on course or not? And if we're not, should we make further interventions that are required to do it? And we've got trajectories in here on reducing the 78-week plus weight, and we've got trajectories on the health checks in your services, Chris. So, are we delivering what we said we were going to deliver? And our discussion around those issues are the trajectories ambitious enough, and where there's variance, do we understand why and can they be corrected? But the more difficult bit to get into for us, I think, and you pick it up, Jeff, by talking about ward level practice at discharge and the variation. Variation's the real killer for us. And one of the things that we can shine a light on here is the extent to which there's different practice and different outcomes, different access service and different outcomes in different parts of this patch. You know, there's nowhere else that's going to happen. So we should do that here and use that to understand how it goes beyond spreading best practice. It's about understanding what in developing standard clinical operating models and so on and so forth are. And in challenge to the provider collaborative board and others, that's where we really want to get to, because we can look at the aggregate data, we can put our head in our hands, we can suck through the teeth, we can roll our eyes, we can sort of reflect, can't they all do a bit better than this? But we can only really get into the value added in terms of challenging trajectories, tracking progress against it, but underneath that, understanding where there's real variation, why, and what we can do to address it. Resilience and surge planning, winter 22-23.
Thank you. Subject that I am most of my colleagues are living and breathing at the moment. Most of what I'm going to just comment on is in Kevin's Chief Exec's update, but I just want to bring us back to this subject and give colleagues around the table opportunity to comment and particularly offer us anything that they think we're missing on. I cannot begin to tell you the amount of correspondence that we are receiving both from the national and regional teams at the moment in relation to winter. It seems not a day goes by without more publications coming out. There are two main publications or directives that we've received. We've talked about both of these at the previous board meetings. The one that gives us the most ability for trajectories and real return on investment type of focus is the Urgent and Emergency Care Assurance Framework. This was the document that I mentioned last month that was published in August that we had to return. We had to get our returns in by about the 26th of September, which we did. We got some good feedback around our document, and that document in essence has got 6 key metrics which I've listed there. We talked a little bit about them before, and we are creating a dashboard that we'll see here for the first time in December, which gives us some of that, what's happening and why in relation to those. The second directive that we received on the 18th of October in the form of a letter from Amanda Pritchard. It outlined more or less everything that was in the previous document, but with some further emphasis. Now, on that slide, you can see that we've got a systems control centre, and that is probably an area that had quite a lot of focus in that letter. And you will have also seen some of that playing out in the media of this winter's going to be full of winter war rooms. The media's portrayal of the systems control centre is very much in that kind of drumbeat of war control rooms. Of the demands of us in the letter from Amanda Pritchard, we've self-assessed ourselves as being about 85% compliant. And again, when we see the dashboard here in December, we're going to pull out the salient elements of that of the ask for us, so that again colleagues here can see the flavour of what we're being asked to do. There is nothing new in that letter. That you would either from last winter, previous winters, or from the assurance framework. Good news, and again we've talked. It's not new good news, but we were awarded just under £13 million as part of the winter allocations. We've got in excess of 135 surge schemes that are either being implemented or in the planning. There is over 140 metrics in relation to those surge schemes. We will not and cannot bring everything back in that dashboard, but those surge schemes just about cover every element of our business, and again we've discussed them previously. We've also now created a winter task and finish group. We met for the first time on Monday of this week, and we've got a tiered approach to how we manage winter going forward. We've some overlap at the moment with the cells that we've had during COVID. Myself and Kevin have got a meeting tomorrow to discuss how we're going to morph into the new winter task and finish group. It will meet weekly during November and December, and it will become more frequent after that, as and when it's required to. We know that we've got some risks, emergent risks from our last conversation a month ago. Just to mention a couple there, we've got industrial action, we've got weather's been very mild to us so far, long may it continue. And of course, we know in the news recently there's been a hint of possible power interruptions during the winter period. So we've got some emergent risks to winters. We know we've got known risks that we've talked about here before. Probably the biggest risk that we talk about, biggest risks are workforce, and again, the not meeting criteria to reside. Mitigations, just mentioned that, we've got in excess of 135 schemes that our people believe are things that will help us during the winter period, and we've got a rather large chunk of funding to help pump prime them during the winter. We've got great scrutiny. Again, back to that Venn diagram, everybody's scrutinising us, both national, regional, PCB, ourselves. We're all in this space, looking at those trajectories on a very frequent basis to see are we delivering what we've set out to do. Governance reporting, that task and finish group meeting weekly will report both into our exec team, which will then end up coming here in that dashboard, and we will also report into the provider collaborative, and there will be reports that go to each of those partners that are in this space with us. A&E delivery boards, again, I haven't had the opportunity yet to attend any of the A&E delivery boards, but we have to be really clear that they've got a place this winter, and by the December board we'll be able to touch on them more in the performance report. You'd be glad to know, David, that's the end of the slides.
Thank you. We will have a more in-depth discussion next month when we start to see some of the data against images. At this stage, I just wanted us to know what the expectations are. In advance of that, though, Maggie, you said we're 85% compliant. Can you give us a flavour of what the 15% is and what we're doing about it?
Yeah, the major gap that we've got is that it's a 24/7 requirement going forward for the system control room to be staffed from a clinical perspective. That gives us quite a challenge because it's how do we use our limited amount of clinical time in the right way. So that is probably the biggest area, and the gold control, the executive approach. If you look at a system like GM where they've got in excess of 10 chief execs that can join the rota, we've not. We've only got 4 of our acute chief execs. So it's that last little bit of compliance around the rota cover to give us 24/7. Not an urgent for today, but it will become more apparent as we get into January onwards.
We got a plan to solve it.
My truth serum is kicking in at this moment in time, and no, I haven't got a plan right now to solve it, but we are working on it.
Okay. Well, we'll update all that next month. So we take any points of, without getting into discussion at this stage, but any points of clarification on Maggie's presentation? Got Jim, Chris, Roy.
Yeah, I suppose my point for clarification really is this was already a bureaucratic process from a trust perspective. What's being added in here is it's basically taking the key players away from actually doing the important bit within the organisation of resolving the problems. And it all needs streamlining somehow. And it's the extent to which collectively we're able to streamline it. Hopefully with the collaborative working that will be easier, but this could become a bureaucratic nightmare.
I absolutely do agree, Jim, with the sentiment of that, and that's why I go back to some of the conversations we're having. Again, speaking on behalf of Kevin, he'll correct me if he disagrees, but the commitment from me and Kevin is that we are not going to allow that to happen. We will work to we will not duplicate from an ICB and PCB perspective conversations with all those who are trying to do this work on the front line. We will work in a harmonious way. Conversations I'm having with our regional colleagues as well is how do we make sure that everything's funneled in one place and we do not distract those people who are out there doing this. I mean, how well I'll influence our national colleagues in that space, I don't know, but I'm sure I'll call on other colleagues around this table if it becomes more onerous than it needs to be. We've still got old world, COVID and emergent ICB worlds playing out. A&E delivery boards are one of those areas. We should only have meetings that are adding value this winter. Those who are closest to it at the moment will tell me which are the meetings that we need to go. We need to move on. I am, apart from streamlining our approach through that task and finish group, we will not be adding to the burden, because you're absolutely right. People need to be getting on with their day job, not coming to meetings.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Maggie. It was just on the emergent risks, and I think in addition to normal winter pressures, we've got cost of living, and it's the impact of that, especially on mental health services, and then how that doesn't then play on into further pressure on acute providers with long waits in A&E departments, etc. So I think, and the system goal that we have is a true system, and that is, I think, to be commended. So it was just
thank you.
Reflect on that.
Point taken. Roy.
Thanks, David. Very briefly, some of us around the table will remember last year the Winter Access Fund. That was money that came to the ICS, and that was then, there were bids came in from CCGs to access that fund. And I think it follows Jim's bureaucratic point, which it was a particularly bureaucratic exercise, I think, at that time. However, there were some very innovative issues that came out, I think, from the CCGs in terms of being able to spend that money within their own areas. There were access for people being discharged from hospitals into care homes. A lot of the money went into primary care for urgent appointments. So really useful money. How that money was spent was really useful, I think, in terms of CCGs. And I guess, Maggie, that money, I guess you'll be identifying now that money will be spent this year as well, the money that's available.
So of the 135 schemes that I've had a chance to have a look at, I'm told a lot of those were the schemes that worked well last year. To be quite honest, a lot of the schemes have run all year at cost and risk, and that is some of the problems that Sam's identified earlier. I hope we get further monies identified that come into us. You referred to earlier to conversations we're having with Tracy, Sarah, myself and Craig and Sam. We can spend more money if we get more money, and there are a lot more schemes that we could introduce if we had the right level of, not the right level, but we had further access to funds. But just in answer to your question, I do believe that a lot of the good schemes from last year are in those 135.
And last word, Kevin?
Yeah, look, I just wanted to come back on Jim's point about the control centre in particular, because I do think you have hit on something that's important. I think we're really lucky here to inherit a strong legacy. You know, we've got a good operation that is well viewed regionally and nationally, so we need to recognise that strong performance. We need to be wary of documenting an emerging crisis in great detail and focus our efforts on resolving the crisis. I think that's the point we're making, Jim, and I think we need probably to take some managed risks in this area, and it's about the 24/7 element of the control centre. We've always had an 8 to 8 operation 7 days a week. There's very little activity outside of that in reality. So that's probably the area that needs attention, that we don't divert effort to measuring rather than doing. So I think it's a point well made, and I think we need to be strong and confident about what we do in this space.
Thanks, Kevin. Right, well done, Maggie. The recommendations in your performance report were implicitly agreed in all the discussion that we've had. All that's good. And just draw on all members of this board as necessary over the next period. Right. Annual review of declaration of interest registers. Could you just invite any questions on this?
Yes, I mean, I think people are probably aware of what it's for, but I would like to just thank Deborah Atkinson and her team for all the work behind this paper and the next one, because obviously these are our key governance documents that we want to have in place. And I think I just wanted to sort of acknowledge the amount of work that's gone in of taking 8 CCGs into one ICB and the work that's been going on. So thank you to Deborah. I'm happy to leave both these papers as just open to questions if you'd rather.
Are we content to note them? Any questions anyone wishes to raise? Well done, Sam. Well done, Deborah. Summary report of committee business. Sheena, I'll come to you first. Anything you wish to add to what's in the paper?
Just to say, as certain paper, very successful development session, really helpful to get us to focus on how do we add value and how do we make sure that we do those 3 levels of assurance. So really useful. And as I mentioned earlier, Debbie and I have done some work about thinking about how do we make sure that we work together effectively, the Quality Committee and the Public Involvement and Engagement Advisory Committee. So thanks, David.
Thanks, Sheena. Debbie, anything you wish to add?
Yep, so really helpful, productive first formal meeting. We'd had 2 workshops sort of prior to that. In terms of advice, I'd commend and draw attention to the strategy for public engagement and involvement that was previously received and endorsed by board. It has been further developed, but it is sort of our formal public commitment of our operating model for how we'll actually work as a system to deliver against national priorities and hopefully exceed sort of minimum requirements and demonstrate best practice around involvement and engagement. There was a very helpful update on the work that Healthwatch is leading for us around establishing a number of community panel events which will be delivered in places and focus on sort of two-way conversations in areas that matter to us as an ICB, but more importantly that matter to local people, to give us sort of rich direct intelligence and feedback from place. And those are being developed with the new Directors of Healthcare Integration. So the first one will be in Cumbria. So we're looking to learn from that model and see what intelligence we gather and how it can impact on decision making and the approach of the board moving forward. Membership is almost complete, which will be fantastic. We had a broad range of involvement, but we just needed to finalise voluntary community sector involvement, and then we're there. And then in terms of sort of assurance, we challenged the comms and engagement team who support this committee to produce an insight report for us that gathers together all of the intelligence and said, so what do we need to sort of do differently and escalate to board or learn from, and then an assurance report. So we look forward to finalising and developing the focus of those and the format, and in particular for the assurance report, building in the 5 delivery programmes and the 3 transformation projects and what's being done around involvement and engagement to give assurance back to board that things are being anchored and taken forward as much as they could do. And then final point was just to thank Dr Lindsay Dickinson, the Associate Medical Director, and also Amanda Bates from the Comms and Engagement team that came along and did our second deep dive around primary care transformation and gave us a really rich picture of how we're engaging and evolving primary care, what the feedback is and how we're acting on it. So we'll be looping back to see and have an update on how that's progressing, that sort of you said we did approach that's really important, but also looking at how that learning impacts on Fuller and also the transformation project around primary and community service transformation, because that's really the opportunity to see if we've learnt from that and we're doing things differently as a result of it.
Great, thank you. David, anything you wish to add to what's in the paper?
Only to say that the contracting group's only been working for about 4 or 5 months now, but actually has matured very quickly. So it's now kind of working very well.
This is one of the ways in which we change the world.
Of course. That's where 90% of the activity takes place every day, so we need to focus on it. But it's working really well, and we're looking forward to kind of taking on the pharmacy, dental and optometry commissioning from April.
Thank you very much. Any points of clarification requested of Sheena, Debbie or David? Thank you. I've not been notified of any other business. The next meeting is on the 7th of December. The venue will be St Catherine's Hospice, which is on the outskirts of Preston and near to the Chorley House office. Thank you. Thank you all for your contributions. First one I've closed on time, so that's starting a new trend. Well done, everybody. Well done.